This is Jay Carper again from AmericanTorah.com and CommonSenseBibleStudy.com. I'm continuing with the series, A Sabbath to Yahweh, with Part 2b. In this video, we're still talking about why does the Sabbath matter. In the previous video, we talked about how it matters because it honors God. Jesus said that the greatest commandment is to love God, and keeping the Sabbath shows love for God. In this video, we're going to talk about how the Sabbath matters because it's good for both you and your community. Let's start by reading Deuteronomy 5:15 again. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and Yahweh your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore YHWH your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. Keeping the Sabbath day according to God's commandment gives us perspective on what God has done for us both physically and spiritually. God commanded ancient Israel to keep the Sabbath because they were slaves in Egypt. And he commands us to keep the Sabbath because we were slaves to sin. When the Hebrews were slaves in Egypt, they didn't get any days off. They had to work when the Pharaoh told them to work. When God brought the Hebrews out of Egypt into the wilderness, the first thing he did was to tell them to keep the Sabbath. He gave these former slaves a day off of work every week, and it seems like refusing to honor that is to show ingratitude for what God has done. Do you want to be a slave again? Resting is a privilege, an act of a free people. Slaves have to work every day of their lives. The world's slaves aren't guaranteed anything. They are at the beck and call of their master any time of day and night, every day of the week. But as servants of God, we are guaranteed a day off from our labors. And in fact, keeping a common Sabbath proves that all people have God-given rights and nobody can own another person absolutely. All authority on earth has only been delegated by God. He still owns all the people everywhere. And God has said we get to take this one day off. And in God's economy, a master can't say, I'm going to take the seventh day off, but I'm going to make my servants work or my employees work and give them Sunday or Monday as their Sabbath. No, God says everybody gets the same day off. Everybody gets that day off to spend with God in their community. And on the Sabbath, everybody is equal before God. Jeremiah 17:21 says, Thus says YHWH, Take care for the sake of your lives, and do not bear a burden on the Sabbath day, or bring it in by the gates of Jerusalem. Take care for the sake of your lives. Refusing to keep the Sabbath brings God's judgment, but keeping the Sabbath is good for your life. Having a guaranteed day off every week is good for your physical, mental, and spiritual health. Everybody needs to take time off of work to recharge. This lowers your stress and improves your relationships, and this creates a cascade of good health effects. Keeping the Sabbath literally adds days to your years and joy to your days. The Sabbath is also good for your family. No matter how busy you are the rest of the week, keeping a weekly Sabbath guarantees that you have time to spend with your family. You, your wife, your children, you all get to spend this one day together with God. Keeping the Sabbath is also good for your whole community. This is a time for everybody to get together in God's name, to worship together, to learn about Him, to study His Word. The weekly Sabbath creates bonds with your neighbors, your family, your distant family, and most especially with God Himself. Let's go down just a little bit further in this chapter and read verses 24 to 26. But if you listen to me, declares YHWH, and bring in no burden by the gates of this city on the Sabbath day, but keep the Sabbath day holy and do no work on it, then there shall enter by the gates of this city kings and princes who sit on the throne of David, riding in chariots and on horses, they and their officials, the men of Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and this city shall be inhabited forever. And people shall come from the cities of Judah and the places around Jerusalem, from the land of Benjamin, from the Sephalah, from the hill country, and from the Negev, bringing burnt offerings and sacrifices, grain offerings and frankincense, and bringing thank offerings to the house of YHWH. Jeremiah delivered this prophecy in the last days of Judah. The city of Jerusalem was on the verge of falling and being taken off into captivity by Babylon. God had decreed that this was going to happen. There was no way out of it. So when Jeremiah says that if everybody in the city keeps the Sabbath day, God would give them security, and the heirs of David would go in and out of the gates and sit on the throne of David, he wasn't talking about that moment. He was talking about the future. Keeping the Sabbath brings security to the people of God. And these verses hint that all of God's people keeping the Sabbath could hasten the return of Israel's Messiah. From Nehemiah 13:19, as soon as it began to grow dark at the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I commanded that the doors should be shut and gave orders that they should not be opened until after the Sabbath. And I stationed some of my servants at the gates, that no load might be brought in on the Sabbath day. Nehemiah didn't care what foreigners did in their own towns or in their own countries. But he said there would be no business done in Jerusalem. He even threatened them that if they camped outside the cities of Jerusalem and lured the people of Israel out to do business on the Sabbath, that he would lay hands on them. As we saw from Jeremiah, Sabbath keeping and Sabbath breaking is a matter of national defense and prosperity. And encouraging Sabbath keeping among all the people ought to be a priority for our civil and national leaders. Luke 13:15 and 16 says, Then the Lord answered him, You hypocrites, does not each of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or his donkey from the manger and lead it away to water? And ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan bound for 18 years, be loosed from this bond on the Sabbath day? We know that ultimately all people won't repent and won't be saved, but God still desires everyone to become a child of Abraham. And so the Sabbath is for the restoration of all mankind. If even the most overbearing legalist knows that an animal should be rescued on the Sabbath, how much more should a daughter of Abraham be rescued so that she too can keep the Sabbath? Was Jesus breaking the Sabbath when he healed the sick? Not at all. The Sabbath is about restoring people to a relationship with God, restoring them to good health and good relationships. We should actively seek ways to help people keep the Sabbath by relieving their burdens. And what about emergency personnel and essential workers? In my opinion, if you have an opportunity to help another person keep the Sabbath, you should do so. In our modern world, we really depend on things like plumbing and electricity just to survive. If someone's toilet is backing up, or their water has stopped flowing, or their heat is out in the middle of winter, these constitute legitimate emergencies. And I think it's fine for someone to go and do those repairs so that those people can be safe and rest on the Sabbath day. I'm not saying that it's okay to break the Sabbath in order to do what you think are emergency repairs. I'm saying that it doesn't break the Sabbath if you're doing something that allows more people to keep the Sabbath for themselves. But be judicious. Not everything that feels like an emergency really is. Whatever it is you think you need to do on the Sabbath, is this relieving other people's burdens, or is it just making you feel better? The weekly Sabbath matters because it shows honor and love for God. It also matters because it's good for you. It's good for your neighbors, for your family, for your relationships. It's good for the entire nation. This is Jay Carper from AmericanTorah.com and CommonSenseBibleStudy.com. In the next video, I'm going to talk about how the Sabbath matters because it's about God's relationship with his people.